Hi everyone, thanks so much for listening to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff and I'll be your host for the show. Before we bring on tonight's guest, if you've had a Dogman encounter and would like to speak with me about it, whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you. If you've had a Sasquatch sighting and would like to be a guest on Bigfoot Eyewitness Radio, please go to bigfooteyewitness.com and submit a report. Hey everyone, I hope you've had a great week. It's been quite some time since I've narrated any encounters, so I thought I would switch things up and do that on tonight's show. So, here we go. Tonight's first encounter happened in Nebraska, and reads, I'm a 15-year-old female from Nebraska. I know you're probably thinking cornfields in the middle of nowhere, but that's not where I'm from. I live in Omaha, but I've always loved the outdoors. I go hunting or hiking almost every weekend with my dad or with friends. Okay, on to the story. This story is 100% true. I went to Nebraska National Forest every long weekend with two friends whose names were Hallie and Todd. I've known them for years and we would never hike alone because of the risks, so we became a group. Anyways, it was spring break last year when we went on a week-long backpacking trip. It was a 7-hour drive there. Being 14, I couldn't drive, but Hallie was 16, so Hallie drove us there and we had a great time for the first few hours of the drive. When we got closer to the forest, though, something felt off. I know it sounds cliche, but I had this feeling like I was going to get sick. I ignored it and thought I was just nervous. So Hallie and Todd, I guess, noticed that I was off. They asked me what was up, and when I told them something wasn't right, they laughed, thinking I was trying to scare them. A few hours later, and the feeling was still there, but we were at the trailhead. I got out and everything was as it should be. We grabbed our packs and off we went. I felt like I was at home in the trees, and the feeling was soon forgotten. We walked a little over 5 miles that day before we set up camp. We had a 2-person tent that Hallie and I had brought, and Todd had a hammock he brought. After we set up camp, ate, and were just chilling by the fire talking, no alcohol or drugs were involved, Todd began complaining about how he didn't want to sleep in his hammock. I didn't want to listen to him complaining, so I offered to switch places with him, and he gladly accepted. So, the night went on like usual until around 2 a.m. when we all got tired and went to bed. Well, everyone but me. I have extremely bad insomnia, so I was just tending to the fire and chilling. Finally, I decided to get into the hammock and read. So, I put out the fire, grabbed my headlamp, and got into the hammock. I noticed that something was off, but I couldn't place what it was. That's when it hit me that the woods were completely silent. You couldn't hear crickets, there were no animal sounds, nothing. My skin started to crawl. Something was off. I turned out my headlamp, then laid down and kept silent. I was hoping to hear some type of animal to ease my concerns. That's when I heard it. Something was dragging against the tent. I wasn't even 5 feet from the tent. It freaked me out, so I did something really stupid. I called out my friends' names. When I did that, the noise stopped. I got no answer, but this feeling of dread was something I haven't felt before or since. That's when I felt it. Something poked the hammock. It wasn't like a soft poke, it was like a jab. I was horrified. What in the world had just touched me, and where was it? I was frozen. I also suffer from anxiety. I felt the panic rising in me. I couldn't understand what was going on. That's when I made another mistake. I decided I wanted to see what had just jabbed me. All of this happened within seconds. I reached up and clicked my light on, and that's when I saw it. It was out of my nightmares. There was a creature about 4 feet above me, staring at me and kind of hunched over. I was about 3 feet off the ground, so this thing was probably 7 to 8 feet tall. It looked like a dog, but it also didn't. It had the face of a wolf, but it was human in a way. Its eyes looked red. Its ears looked like clipped pit bull ears. Its mouth pulled back in a snarl, and it used its hand, claw, paw thing to block its face. I was terrified. Its teeth were huge and sharp. Its paws, if you could even call them that, had 5-finger type things with sharp, long claws that looked like they could tear me apart. I stared at this thing for what felt like hours, but it was only probably 5 seconds. That's when I screamed bloody murder. As soon as I did that, this thing let out something between a scream and a howl. It was deep and I could feel it. That's when I heard Todd yell, "What in the world was that?" I heard the tin opening, and that's when the creature and I finally broke eye contact. I yelled at Hallie and Todd to help me. I looked back up and this thing was climbing the frickin' tree. It was still staring at me though. That's when I saw the back of it. It had the tail of a dog, grayish silver fur, a black mane down its back, and a hump. I took this opportunity to scramble out of my hammock and we took off without grabbing anything. I had no shoes, nothing. We made it to the car, but the whole time back I heard something in the trees. The next day we had park rangers go get our things as we were too freaked out to go back and get them ourselves. When they got there, everything was gone. Not even trash remained. It was as if we were never there. They blamed us for lying. We had no idea what had happened. I had no idea what I saw or why it didn't just kill me. I haven't been back in the woods for a very long time, but still every time I close my eyes, I see that thing or hear its roar. I have extremely bad anxiety now and find talking on the phone very triggering. I would talk to you, but I don't think it's possible. This next encounter is from New York State and reads, "Hi Vic, I found your podcast a few months ago and I just want to say that I'm a big fan. I've had 2 Dogman encounters and for years I wasn't sure what it was I saw or heard and always wondered what it was until I found your show and realized that it must have been a Dogman. I'm 43 years old now and I've been an avid outdoorsman my whole life. I love hunting, fishing, and just being outdoors. I grew up in the southern tier of New York. My father was a Force Recon Marine in Vietnam and never really stopped being a Marine after he got out. I tell my friends that I went through 18 years of boot camp growing up. With that said, he made sure we knew how to survive in the woods. So, we spent most of my childhood in the woods camping, hunting, and doing other training. As I got older, he started letting me and my cousins go off by ourselves on weekend trips in our woods. Eventually, I was allowed to go by myself. We had this one area far up in the woods, at least a mile or 2 away from home. We built a super fort in a group of pine trees up on top of this ridge, and by super fort I mean we cut 8 to 10 inch diameter trees down with a chainsaw and built a teepee type structure with a heavy door and a hole at the top so we could have a fire inside. My dad cut out very small rectangular holes in the side so we could see outside. He said if we were going to be up there alone, he wanted us to have a safe place to sleep. It was a fortress. Nothing was going to be able to force its way inside. After it was built, it wasn't unusual in the summertime if I went up there for days on end. And then I'd only come home long enough to shower, grab a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter, and then go right back up there. It was the summer before my senior year in 1995, and I knew it was going to be my last summer at home, so I wanted to camp as much as possible that year. Usually my cousin and I were together, but this weekend he had stuff to do and couldn't come up with me. So, I packed up the 4-wheeler with my gear and guns and headed up to camp. The first night I woke up around 2 a.m. to a horrible smell. It was like a cross between a skunk and a dead animal. I sat up and looked out the portholes to see if something or someone was out there. I didn't see or hear anything though. After 10 minutes or so, the smell went away. I still didn't see or hear anything, so I went back to sleep. The next day I woke up and did my usual thing. I went exploring and hunting and shot a couple of squirrels for dinner. Then I went back and built a fire, cooked up my dinner, and then relaxed by the fire. I went to sleep that night around 9 or 10 if I remember right, and like clockwork I was woken up at 2 a.m. again to the same smell as from the night before. This time though it was about 10 times stronger, so I sat up and listened. I could make out footsteps outside about 50 yards away. I looked out the portholes and didn't see anything at first. After a few minutes though, I could make out the dark outline of something walking around just outside the pines. The moon was out, but all I could make out was the shape of a very large body. I knew it wasn't anyone I knew because of the size of it, so I figured it was some weirdo trying to scare me. So I yelled, "Whoever you are, you better get out of here now. I'm armed and will fire if I have to." As soon as I yelled, all noise stopped, but the smell was still there. A few minutes went by and all of a sudden I heard this ungodly howl. It was so loud it hurt my ears. I've never to this day heard anything like that before or since. It started out kind of like a scream and went into a low, bassy growl. I could feel it in my chest. I've heard every type of call of any animal that could be in the woods, and this was nothing like anything I've ever heard. It did it 3 times. By this time, I was terrified beyond belief. I sat down and was silent, barely breathing. After a few minutes went by, it howled again 3 more times. Then I heard footsteps getting closer. Soon, I heard it right outside the fort, sniffing and scratching at the wood. By this time, I was in tears. I grabbed my shotgun, filled with my dad's homemade buckshot, and fired 3 rounds out the smoke hole in the roof as a warning, figuring that the noise would scare it away. It kind of worked. I heard it run off, but it didn't stay away. It came back a minute later, but it stayed at the edge of the pines. I worked up the nerve to get up and look out one of the holes where I was hearing the footfalls, and it was pacing back and forth at the edge of the pines. I watched it and tried to make out what the heck it was. After a few seconds, I could make out what looked like a long, thick tail, and then it stuck his head out from behind a tree, and it looked like an oversized dog's head. I couldn't make out any distinctive features, just an outline. It had a long muzzle, long pointy ears, and its upper body was huge. I remember just watching it, thinking, what in the world is that? It must have seen me looking at it or something because it started howling again. That's when I thought I was done for. It continued to pace and howl from the edge of the pines till about an hour before sunrise. I just sat there shaking and crying, gripping my shotgun the whole night. When the sun came up, I sat there for a while, looking out to make sure it was gone. Then I grabbed my gun and backpack, jumped on my wheeler, and hauled tail. I've never ridden that fast in my life. I rode that way all the way home. When I got home, my dad was waiting for me outside because he heard me coming like a bat out of hell down the hill. When I stopped, I jumped off the wheeler, grabbed him, and dragged him into the house. He was like, "What in the world is wrong with you?" I sat down crying, and I don't cry. I was bawling, so he knew something was wrong and that I was scared out of my mind. I told him about everything that happened. For being a gung-ho Marine, he's actually very open-minded about stuff like Bigfoot, ghosts, and aliens. So he believed me and tried to help me figure out what it was. But we had no idea. A few days later, my dad and I went for a ride up to the fort to look for prints and check the area. When we got there, it looked like a bomb had gone off inside the fort. It was completely torn down. Logs were scattered everywhere. It was built strong. For something to do that to it, it had to be strong as all get out. After that, we never went back up to that area. My second encounter was more of a sighting than an encounter. It was about 10 or 12 years after my first encounter. I moved up to the Warsaw, New York area after I got out of the Marines. Like father, like son. It's about an hour and a half north of where I grew up. Got a job at a factory about 30 minutes away. I was and still am an avid hunter, so on my way home from work, I usually took back roads and drove slowly to scan fields and look for critters. It was just something I liked to do. I was coming down this road that not many people used, and there were only 1 or 2 farms on the road. I wasn't seeing much and was about to speed up and head home. That's until I came upon this field and saw something way in the back of it on top of a pile of logs and brush. So I was like, what is that? So I stopped, grabbed my binoculars, got out of the truck, and stood there watching it. It was about 400 to 500 yards away. From that range, it still looked huge. At first, I thought it was a black bear, but then I looked through the binoculars. It was still a little hard to make out, but I could tell it wasn't a bear. It was on top of a log pile, bouncing up and down with its front legs. I don't know if you've ever seen a fox or coyote bouncing up and down on its front legs to break through ice or snow to get at something, but that's what this thing was doing. I watched it do that for a minute or two, then it got weird. Now understand, these were logs. I mean 18 to 20 inches in diameter and about 10 to 15 feet long. It must have gotten frustrated and grabbed the top log and threw it off the pile like it was a toothpick. My jaw hit the ground. I thought to myself, it just grabbed that log like it had hands and threw it like it was nothing. That log had to have been 500 to 600 pounds. After it tossed it, it grabbed whatever it was, coon, woodchuck, or something like that, and jumped off the woodpile, landed on its rear legs, and started walking on two legs. I just stood there in awe. It had a tail and the legs looked like a dog's. It stopped walking and finished off whatever it had grabbed. It looked like it had coon hands, and the head looked like a German shepherd's with long pointed ears. At that point, I put two and two together and my blood ran cold. Remembering that night years ago, I was like, oh crap, it's one of those things that attacked me in the fort. Instant terror. This thing had to have been 7 to 8 feet tall. It hadn't noticed me yet, and I figured it was far enough away, so I just watched for a few minutes as it walked along heading towards the tree line. All of a sudden, though, this car came around the corner fast. I looked at the car as it passed for a split second, and when I looked back, the thing was looking straight at me. It had yellow amberish eyes and it looked pissed. It took 2 steps towards me and I darn near peed myself. I ran to the driver's door and jumped in and tore out of there. As I was leaving, I looked back down in the field and it was running on 2 feet into the tree line. It covered about 100 yards in a few seconds. For years I wondered what they were. All I could come up with was that they were werewolves. That is, until I found your show. Since then, I've been researching and trying to learn as much as I can about them. I hope this wasn't too long, but this is the first time I've told anyone, other than my dad who's gone now, about this. It kind of feels good to get it off my chest. This next encounter happened in Mason County, Kentucky, and reads, I live in southern Ohio near the Ohio River. A few friends and I decided to go explore an abandoned hospital that backs up to a giant hill and large forest across the river in Maysville, Kentucky. It was a local spot for dumb teenagers to go and scare each other and make out with their girlfriends, so running into other people wasn't uncommon. You could usually tell if other people were there because there would be cars parked near it. That being said, on this night we were the only dumb teenagers there. The moment we got out of the car, though, everything felt wrong. We knew we weren't allowed to be there because the building was condemned, but it felt like we were actually in danger, which of course we always were because it was condemned. It just felt different, though. Now, by this time, I had been to Hayeswood Hospital 20 times or so and was familiar with the layout. Once the 3 of us had been inside about 45 minutes, we split up to tag some different places and explore. I went to go take pictures of the morgue in the basement to see if I could photograph any orbs or anything really cool. I had been in the morgue about 10 minutes when I smelled the foulest smell I've ever smelled. It was rot. I didn't know what was rotting. I imagined it was a large dog or a coyote, but all I could make out was that it was about 40 pounds of rotting meat. I had just started to look at the meat chunk when I heard a steel door slam and what sounded like something running through puddles of water, which meant whatever it was in the basement with me because the floor had about 3 inches of water standing on it. So naturally, I figured it was my friends playing a prank on me. That was when I decided to get them back and scare them before they could scare me. Now, the way the morgue was set up, you could actually climb on top of the coolers they used to store the bodies, so I hopped up there and laid in wait to scare the crap out of my friends. I had been there no more than a minute when I heard screaming. Now, I've known my friends my entire life, which at this point had been 19 years. I've never heard screaming like this before. The screaming stopped and I heard hard footsteps running above me and what I could best describe as pounding. Now, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't freaking out a little bit because this wasn't like my friends. It was usually hide behind a corner and jump out and go gotcha. This was different. This was dread I was starting to feel. As I continued to lay there, about 5 minutes had passed when I heard panting and footsteps in the water. They were getting closer. That was when I smelled wet dog, but it wasn't just wet dog I was smelling. I was smelling that same smell of rot too. Then, another steel door slammed, and I could tell it was the same door I passed before I got to the morgue's door. The panting was even louder now, and honestly, it sounded more like labored breathing and sniffing. Now, at this point, I was terrified. I tried to slowly back away from the edge of the cooler I was on so I could slip behind the wall the cooler backs up to and drop into the boiler room. I was almost to the end of the cooler when I heard the morgue door slam open and break the tiles on the wall with the door handle. I was less than 35 feet from whatever was panting and smelling like death, and all I could do was think, run, run, run. I could hear the sniffing, and then I heard the deepest, most menacing growl I'd ever heard. The movies and shows don't do justice to just how deep and rough a growl of that size sounds. It was sniffing me out. It was actually smelling where I had been. I dropped down behind the wall in the boiler room and thanked God that the door that connected the morgue to it was blocked with old gurneys and a locker on its side, because I thought that would stop that thing from getting in. I was wrong, so very wrong about that. I hadn't been in the boiler room 30 seconds before I heard pounding and scratching on the steel door. It sounded like Freddy Krueger was trying to carve his way through the steel door. Then I heard a sound that still haunts me to this day. It howled, and I mean it bellowed a howl so loud I had to cover my ears. Now on the other side of the boiler room was access to the generator, the dock doors trucks used to unload, and the hillside that leads to the woods. When I reached the other side of the room, I could hear this thing slamming into the door and knocking the lockers and gurneys away. I opened the door to the dock room, and when I looked back, I saw the arm of this creature sticking through the opening it had made, and it was like a horror movie. It was a gray and brown mass of fur. It looked like a human arm, but in a way it didn't, because the hand was all wrong. The hand had 5 digits, but the claws would have made a bear run in fear. I slammed the door behind me and ran for the dock doors. The dock doors wouldn't budge. I could hear the gurneys overturning and the lockers sliding on the floor. It was getting through, and the only thing between me and it now was a single door. I ran to one of the windows by the dock doors and proceeded to bust it out, which mangled my hand from the glass. Then, as I was pulling myself through the window, I heard the door get slammed into, and one of the hinges completely flew off the door and hit the wall. I tumbled out of the window and hit the cold, wet ground. When I stood up, I saw it in the doorway. Now I'm 6'4", 250 pounds, not little by any means, and this thing took up the entire 8-foot tall by 3-foot wide doorway. It was covered head to toe in gray-brown fur and had a very narrow snout, almost like a Doberman pinscher. Its ears were just barely visible because of the doorway, but I could tell they were pointing up just like a dog's. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was completely paralyzed. This thing was staring right into my soul, looking at every delicious part it was going to enjoy. I've never felt like an item on a menu before, but I can tell you, it's terrifying. Then it snarled, and that woke me from my disbelief of what I was seeing. I turned and ran. I ran up the hill into the woods to get around the hospital and get back to the street where the car was parked. I hadn't made it 25 feet when I heard it clawing to get out the window. I knew I would never make it to the car this way, so I ran back towards the hospital where the fire escape ladder was. I had used the ladder before to climb to the roof to take pictures of the entire town. I completely skipped the first 3 rungs on the ladder and now was inside the enclosed part of the fire escape. Again, this thing howled, and I could feel waves of pure terror filling my body. My hand was killing me at this point, and I was getting blood on everything. Just as I was reaching a first-floor window I could climb into, this thing slammed into the fire escape ladder, knocking me down a couple of rungs. Then it leaped onto the outside of the fire escape and began clawing at my feet. Just as I reached the window, I felt it, pain like nothing I'd ever felt. It had grabbed me just above my ankle and yanked, and in doing so shredded my boot, the end of my jeans, and my flesh. I was able to pull myself into the first floor window and heard it push itself off the fire escape and head back the way it came. Now at this point I was dragging my left leg and was trying to keep my right hand in my hoodie pocket. The entrance we came in was only about 150 feet away down the main hall and around a left turn. As I was halfway down the hall, I heard the steel doors slamming again. I was dragging myself down the hall, just trying to stay focused on getting out of this hellhole when the howling started again. I could hear it getting closer. I made the turn and heard pounding coming up the stairs from the basement. I made it to the entrance then and heard the patting of hands and feet on the floor. I made the mistake of looking back just as it rounded the corner and saw that it was running on all fours like a real dog. I bolted down the hill towards the street where the car was parked and realized the car was gone. They left me. My only means of escape was gone. I just zoned out and kept running down the hill. My leg was throbbing, my hand was in agony, and all I could think was, I'm going to be dog kibble. Finally, I made it to the first house I could find and ran full force into the door. I began pounding on it like a crazy person, and thank God this little old lady was home because she opened the door. When she did, I literally fell inside, and just before I kicked the door closed, standing up on two legs at the end of her driveway was this monster. I broke down in tears. I didn't know what to do. Luckily, the old lady had called the cops because a crazy person who was bleeding everywhere just fell into her home. When the cops got there and asked me what happened, I told them the same thing I've said here, and of course they didn't believe me. They thought I was on drugs. The EMTs took me to the hospital, and when they did blood work and found no substance in my system, they concluded I was attacked by a wild dog. I ended up with 36 stitches in my leg and 17 in my hand. I had to get rabies shots and tell the local wildlife officer my story. He informed me that they had reports of wild dog packs running around outside the town, ransacking garbage cans and killing some of the local pets. I informed him that it wasn't a pack of wild dogs. It was a giant Dogman, but they all just thought I was crazy. The only thing I had in my favor was the claw mark on my leg. Even the doctors were confused about how a wild dog could make a mark like that. Now you know my story, and you know why I absolutely know we're not at the top of the food chain. I've never been back to Hayeswood Hospital, and I've deterred anyone from ever going there. That experience has haunted me for the last 11 years of my life. It's made me into the overcautious man I am. I always have to know where every exit is when I walk into a building, and I always have to know where large clumps of woods are. This experience changed me forever, and it changed the way I look at the world we live in. Just because we all haven't seen something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means some people haven't been hunted for their life. I have no doubt what stalked me that night was the Dogman. I know it in my bones. This last encounter happened in Washington County, Minnesota, and reads, it was the summer of '97. I was 13 years old and was rollerblading from a part of town called Old Cottage Grove. I guess I should start off by saying the city this happened in was a suburb of St. Paul, Minnesota, called Cottage Grove. It was around 9:30 p.m. and I was rollerblading back home from a girlfriend's house with a friend. We were just coming around a bend in the road that was directly along a farm that I believe at the time was called Green Acres Farm. I'm not exactly sure what it was they did, but I do know for sure at the time there were always cattle of all different age, size, and gender, which brings me to the conclusion that maybe I was just at the right place at the wrong time. As I was rounding the bend in the road to start coming up the hill, I felt a very strong sense of fear. It was like my body was telling me to get the heck out of there, yet I couldn't figure out why. I can tell you this much, for the first and only time in my life, I felt like I, a man, was no longer at the top of the food chain. Right when I started to pick up the pace to get out of there is when I heard what came from the fenced-in cattle farm to my left, maybe 15 to 20 yards behind me. I heard what sounded like nails grabbing a pole or fence, then what sounded like what a dog's paws/nails sound like when walking on or running on tile floor, except this just sounded like a quick leap on the street's pavement. As I turned around to look, there stood what looked to be a wiry gray-haired werewolf. It was like time stopped. There was a streetlight at the time in the woods, maybe 5 feet behind it, so all I could make out was a silhouette of this monster. It had to be at least 7 feet tall with the head of what looked like a German shepherd. It had huge ears and a huge snout. I could see this thing was built like a bodybuilder. It stood bipedal like a man, not like what some folks say with these things having dog-like limbs. It also had long slim hands/fingers with black nails and a slim waist. Its huge upper body was muscular beyond belief. The thing that always stuck with me, besides the point of seeing this thing in the first place, was that his head was turned to the side and snout up in the air. The one thing that really stuck out and was out of place to me was that I could see this thing's breath as though it was winter, but mind you, it was the end of June, almost July. It looked as though it was smelling my scent, but that's just what it looked like. I'm not positive on that. Before I knew it, I was yelling to my friend to get out of there and not to look back, but it's almost as though he was in another world because he didn't seem to feel, let alone see what I just experienced. I'm somewhat of an artist and drew a picture of what I, my 13-year-old mind at the time, thought I saw, which was that of a werewolf. Fast forward 17 years later, and still I never told anyone about this encounter. That is, until my oldest brother and I were trading stories one summer evening, and it just sort of came up as we were talking about Bigfoot. Mind you, my brother is a firm believer of this animal, so I said the heck with it and started telling him the story I just told you, going to the point of pulling out the original drawing I drew of it. To my surprise, he didn't laugh at me like I was positive he was going to do. Instead, he started asking me if I had ever heard of the Michigan Dogman or seen anything on it, which I replied, no. He then pulled up an image on the internet of a sketch that an eyewitness had drawn, and I swear to you, it sent shivers down my spine. Not only did it look like my drawing, it also looked exactly like the thing I saw that night in the summer of '97 in Old Cottage Grove, Minnesota. Ever since then, I still find myself trying to wrap my head around what I saw. I'm 33 years old now, yet I still find myself trying to rationalize what I crossed paths with that night. It feels good to get this out there and somewhat off my chest. I hope someone finds something helpful in this experience, and I hope to never have it happen again. Well, that was the last encounter of the night. Thanks as always so much for listening. Have a great night. If you've had a Dogman encounter of your own and would like to speak with me, whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you.